Okay, hi everyone. My name is Marika. I am a PhD candidate at York University, and today I'm going to be talking about cultural and racial representations in French immersion classes, perspectives from racially minoritized students. And I hope this goes smoothly. Amazing. I just wanted to briefly acknowledge the land. We are on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, UTM in the name. And this is just a paragraph I took from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation website. And I encourage you, people who might not be from the area, to look up and learn more about them. Oh, I don't know what this is. I'll just hit okay. Great. I'm going to skip this because I prepared too much and go straight into a tiny background in literature. So I am a French immersion teacher. I noticed that there was an issue with access and racism, basically. And so my master's thesis investigated French immersion policies, and now my PhD is looking at more specifically experiences related to race and racism. So from that study came an interesting finding about culture and racial representation. So that's what this presentation is focusing on. So briefly, I define culture kind of following the Ministry of Education's, what is that called? Curriculum, which is the first one under definition. So the customary beliefs, values, social forms, and material traits of an ethnic, religious or social group, including the arts, literature, lifestyles, and traditions. There are many levels like deep culture or surface culture. There's also things like critical culture, which thinks about inequities and having multiple cultures within one overarching one. And the fact that culture is not simply just one thing. Like it's not just geography, it's not just history, but it's a combination of many different things. Generally speaking, there's a move away from cultural teaching and learning towards intercultural, which just thinks more with the kind of deep critical orientation towards culture. It looks at the relationship between the self and the other, and is also what is called for in the curriculum. You have to develop intercultural competence. So that's why I'm just outlining it briefly there. Despite the fact that it's part of the curriculum and should be part of, French immersion classrooms, a lot of teacher preparation courses don't include cultural teaching at all, or they include very little, or they only teach surface culture. So teachers and teacher candidates feel really underprepared to teach culture, unfortunately. And, scholars are calling for targeted teaching around how to teach culture or intercultural competence. And generally speaking, there are barriers such as time and money. One of the main ways that people believe, but also it is true, one of the main ways to learn about different cultures is through travel and contact. And obviously, if you don't have the time or money to travel, it's very hard to then develop your own intercultural competence that you can then teach to your students. Cultures are always changing, so that makes it also very difficult. The resources and the textbooks that are widely available often only present a surface culture, which essentializes things. And even the ministries, so the curriculum itself, this is an upcoming study, kind of emphasizes tourism culture and exoticizes difference. So the resources at the disposal of teachers are really lacking. I'm going to skip most of this because I want to get to the findings. But teaching culture is very important because it's one way to motivate students to be engaged in class. And also you can't teach a language without knowing its culture is essential just for communicating, because there's certain things that don't make sense unless you understand the culture. So like I said, this was part of my overarching study. So my research questions for my PhD are, what are the experiences of racialized minority students in French immersion programs? How do they narrate and explain their experiences? And what themes and needs emerge from these experiences? So this presentation is really looking at the cultural aspect of that. My study is framed by critical race theory overarchingly. And then there's also the intercultural perspective developed by Littlecode and Scarino, and culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies for this portion. So my participants, I actually only had 3 for stage 1, so we'll get into stage 2 in a second, but we got into a lot of depth with these 3 participants. I had Ace, these are all pseudonyms, who is a Black woman. She identified as Anglophone or sometimes bilingual. She was fairly critically minded and she had overall negative experiences in French immersion. There was Roy, who's a Black man, again, identified as Anglophone or sometimes bilingual. He was somewhat critically minded and he had overall kind of neutral or negative experiences. This is how they reported it. And Hassan was a South Asian man. He identified as multilingual. He also said he had really bad memory, which is important later on because a lot of stuff he couldn't remember or wasn't quite sure. He was not very critically minded and he had overall neutral or positive experiences. So I recruited online, also through word of mouth, mostly through email and social media. And it was mostly in the GTA because it was my own personal network, which is in the GTA. So stage one looked at play building, which is a form of data generation where participants get together over a shared topic and you create a play, basically based in like research. So instead of creating a play, we created monologues because it happened entirely online and it was kind of hard to make that work. Stage two, I compiled all of their stories and their monologues. I put them on a website, which you can access via this QR code. And participants are welcome to respond to the different stories, as well as the suggestions that stage one participants came up with. So it just kind of opens it up to different stakeholders across the province. And hopefully stage three will happen. If they're interested, we'll be doing some member checking in June or July. Oh, and yeah, because stage two closes today. So. Yeah, no, you can totally participate till today. I'm not gonna look till Monday, so, but yeah. Oh, I have some at the end as well, and it will be available at the end. So like I said, this focuses on stage one and really looks at the stories, the monologues. There were some transcripts from our focus group sessions. There was post-study interviews, my own notes, and data was analyzed mainly thematically, some elements of critical discourse analysis, as well as content analysis. So the findings, how are we for time? Great. So the biggest finding overall, which was pretty shocking to me, was that culture was almost never studied. We went kind of year by year. We're like, so do you think, can you remember any of these? And it was like, no. So, which was kind of concerning. So here's a summary chart of that. In each year of the FSL curriculum, you're supposed to study a different cultural group. Grades 1 to 4 is local, like Franco-Ontarians in Ontario, for instance. I will say that Hassan said, you know, we studied all of these, but he couldn't really give me any more detail. He said, you know, I have a bad memory. I don't really know, but we definitely covered it. So he had a lot of an assurance in himself that happened. Whereas Ace and Roy, for the most part, it was, no, we didn't study these, or if we did, it was in a geography class. And that's kind of where it came up a lot, which is why I emphasize the point about what is culture. It's not just geography. Is that an element of it? Yes. However, that was the only way that it seemed to come up, at least for Roy. And then moving on, there's a little bit better in their kind of grade 8 onward experiences. So France was studied. However, I thought it would be studied a lot. That was my own bias, but it turned out that they only really studied a book or two. And that's where they got exposure to France throughout their entire 12, 13 years in French immersion. Europe, they studied not at all, which was interesting. Africa and Asia, a little bit. However, when I asked Ace about this, oh, sorry, that was, I don't know, it wasn't Africa. It's for the Caribbean, actually. When I asked Ace about the Caribbean, she laughed aloud and went, no way. I only knew about the French Caribbean because my uncle's from Haiti. So like, that was just something that she knew by chance. So then Africa and Asia, it only happened when the teachers themselves were from those areas. And Asia wasn't studied at all. Like, that was not, so it's just Africa. And then worldwide, that's where we got to see a little bit more of some of the actual curricular focus. Ace said, interestingly, I didn't even know that Franco-Ontarian was a term. So like that shows to what extent that, you know, she knew nothing about a local French culture after spending 12 or I think it was 13 years. Whereas, like I said, Hassan, he felt like, you know, they covered everyone. When I kind of really pushed him, he only could think about, you know, the fact that he had studied, I think he listed like 5 countries. And one of the facts that stood out to him was that there were gorillas and they were endangered in one of them. So not necessarily a cultural element, but that's all he could remember. And so I wondered maybe how was he defining culture? And that was something we didn't define together since it wasn't the focus of the study, it kind of just came out. So that's something I'm hoping to clarify in the follow-up sessions. And again, geography class, that's where it was really studied. One thing that I do want to emphasize is, while they say, you know, we didn't study it at all, they might have studied it a little, but their point was that it wasn't enough to be memorable. Like maybe it was a lesson here or there, but it wasn't like we spent a unit, we spent a year it was very much as on an aside. And sadly, for Ace and Roy, Hassan actually wasn't here for the session, so I'm not sure. But for Ace and Roy, they both said they didn't know they were supposed to be studying culture at all. And then Ace went on to say, I thought I was supposed to be able to speak French. So not only were they not studying culture, they weren't learning French in their own words. So it was verbs and nothing in Roy's teaching, or sorry, perspective. So culture and race were studied when the teacher was a person of color. That's kind of what came out the most. So Hassan was really like, yeah, when I had very diverse teachers and they brought their culture into the classroom. And that's when he felt that he learned the most. The same thing for Ace. She had a teacher from Africa, but she also said it wasn't really taught that much. He just would say every once in a while, like, you know, people in Africa speak French and my French is better than yours. That's another thing that he said. So there's still negative elements there. When the cultures were studied, so it was barely studied, it was mostly white and Eurocentric cultures that they did study. So Quebec was huge. Like I said, France, shockingly, was not studied a lot by any of them, whereas Quebec, there's been a shift, I guess, to a slightly more local culture, which is a good sign. But that being said, it was always white protagonists, white stories, white parts of history. That's what they were studying, or white people and white men. Yep, so yeah, not much else studied. Let's go on. Some racial and cultural diversity was present, although it often was kind of as a one-off lesson, as I said before. This is kind of an example of where it was. Most of what was seen was with Indigenous peoples. Interestingly, none of the participants grouped them under people of color. When I asked them about, you know, non-white groups, they never spoke about Indigenous people, but then they came up in another part of our long sessions. Black people was kind of the second most studied group. And then after that, there was almost nothing. So Asian, I think, was once, but it wasn't like the Francophonie Asian. It was talking about the Canadian Pacific Railway. So there was no actual connection to like French culture, but there was some Asian representation. And even to the point where Hassan refused to link himself to being a French speaker because of his South Asian identity. And he said, you know, like, if it's different if you're Black because they colonized Africa. But like, for me, I can't be a French speaker. This is about Indigenous people. So discussion implications. Obviously, the curriculum isn't being implemented how it's supposed to be. While this is only 3 examples, they do come from 3 different areas, 3 different, well, I think actually 6 or 7 different schools that they attended over their time period. They weren't studying culture. They also talked about, because of that, maybe there should be a separate cultural course. So that's something that was one of the suggestions that came out of my study. Cultural learning is often a one-off. It's very obvious then that teachers need more resources and better training on how to teach from an intercultural perspective, because it's not there for them, and the curriculum itself is also maybe not the best resource either. So again, there's the need to move from cultural, actually there's a need to move from nothing to cultural to intercultural. And within that, diversity is very, very much needed. Some limitations, obviously, had a very small sample size, so it's only 3 participants. And Hassan was also less forthcoming and had a bad memory, so it's hard to, you know, base a lot off of that. And they are referencing things from years and years and years ago. So again, while it's a retrospective, it's been a long time. And culture wasn't defined as a group. That being said, stage 2 is really hoping to expand that out so that it's less limited. So next steps are really looking at how we can have some teacher interventions with professional development, integrating travel, interaction, as well as research interventions, thinking about how we can you know, scale up this study to see if this is kind of across the board, or if maybe I just happened upon 3 unique cases with bad cultural learning, who knows? And I will do a shout out to FSL Disrupt, who is doing some of this work around that. It's at fsldisrupt.org, that's looking at diversifying the different cultures represented in classrooms. That is the end. This is my contact information. That's the first QR code will give you the link to the website and survey if you're interested. I also do have papers in person if you want one of those. And then the second one is this presentation. It's my email. Please feel free to email me and some of my websites.